All right, good morning, guys. I'm so excited to be here with you all. If you all don't know me, my name is Caleb Grimes. I was an alumni from Settle Creek High School. Woo! Yeah. And now I'm studying Christian ministries over at Winston's alma mater school, Central Christian College of the Bible. And so I am so excited that I get to be here and talk to you guys about what we're going to talk about today. So, you all have been in this series called The Problem with Christmas, and finding out that Christmas, we have a gift that is so much more than what we think. We have a gift that can really touch our hearts and can mean more than any present that we get. And so today, I get the opportunity to talk to you guys about why we should celebrate a God who can do the unbelievable. And this is so important because knowing that we have a God who can do anything that's possible, I don't know about you all, but it empowers me. It empowers me to go out and to do things I never thought were possible. And so to explain all this, I kind of want to start off with a story that's kind of an analogy that I think you guys would get. So let's just say that I go and I play a game with 9 story with you guys. And I'm just hitting the ball down on people, I'm winning game after game after game, and I'm just saying, God is allowing me to do this. This is really awesome. And then the next day I come back and play a game of knockout or something. And I shoot every single hoop in, I mean just one after another, and I'm getting people out, and I say, oh, this is all for God, like this is incredible. You kind of start to think, what is up with this guy? Like, how is he doing this? Like, this seems impossible, right? Well then, take it one step further. What about if I came back the next day, and let's just say you were going through a tough situation, and I sat down with you, and I started to talk to you, and before you even opened your mouth on what was going on, I knew exactly what your past was, what you were going through, and what you would be going through in the future. You all would probably think I'm crazy, right? Like, that seems impossible. But what about if the next day, you came to me and you had a friend who just fell off their bike or fell off their skateboard and broke their leg and tore it up completely? And what about if I had prayed over that person and said, you are now healed, and they were healed? I don't know about you guys, I would be shocked. I would be like, how in the world did this happen? But what about if it went even further and the next day you saw me at Deems Lake or on the Ohio River and you all were out boating? And there was a crazy storm going on, and you're just rocking back and forth in the boat, and I tell the seas to stay still, and they stay still. Or what about if I decide to even start walking on water? I'd be considered crazy, right? Like, all these things sound impossible. And I want to encourage you guys today that the impossible can still happen even today in your all's lives. And so I want to kind of tell you all about a story that means a whole lot to me, and I've been thinking a lot about this while in Bible college. So I'm going to walk you through some stories, and hopefully by the time I get to the point where I want to get to, you'll kind of be seeing where I'm going. So in a story in a book, I read about how from darkness, light was created. With a single word, the earth was made, and you were made. In the same story, in the same book, I read about a people who were building a tower to a god, and this God was really confused of why they were doing this. And so he decided to split them up and give them different languages to have. What would that have looked like? In the same story, in the same book, I read about a young boy who, among his 12 brothers, was the weakest. He was thrown into a pit, sold into slavery, and went all the way to Egypt. And after being in prison for a couple of years, this young boy, who you think is a nothing, went to be the second in command in Egypt and ruled over the people and over his family. In the same book, in the same story, I read about this people in Egypt who were in the middle of slavery, and all these terrible things were going on. And a man walks into Pharaoh and says, I'm going to perform these signs and wonders that are going to blow you away. And so he comes in and turns the Nile. You think about how big the Nile is. He turns it to blood. He takes, and people begin to have boils, frogs infest the whole land. There's hail, locusts, darkness covers the land. And beyond that, even the firstborn is killed of every family. So imagine this story, but it doesn't just stop here. In the same story, in the same book, I've read about a people who were on the middle of a cliff looking out over a sea, and there's a whole army behind them who are coming up and about to capture them. The same people that were in Egypt. And within a moment, God parted the seas and allowed them to walk through. Same story and the same book, I read about how fire came down out of heaven and consumed a sacrifice. As weird as that may sound, that's what happened. And the same story in the same book, I read about these people who went to go fight a battle, and 300,000 people died. And 300,000 people died, but none of their men had died. Incredible things. But it goes on even further to say, in the same book, in the same story, this people went to go conquer a whole land. And for most of the battles that they had fought, they won them all and lost hardly anybody. So in the same story, in the same book, I read about a woman who lost her husband, who lost her sons, lost their wives, and she is left with nobody except for her daughter-in-law. And this daughter-in-law is a nobody. She's a foreigner, and people just did not like her. And she decided to walk alongside her mother-in-law and stay faithful to her. And through this whole situation, God's working behind the scenes to allow her to finally end up getting married, to have an inheritance back, and to be accepted back to everybody. Still, the impossible is happening, one after another. But not only that, but in the same story, in the same book, I read about a young shepherd boy. And this boy had nothing to him. He was a shepherd, and shepherds weren't considered high class. They were considered the lowest class. And this little boy was told by a God that he would become king of a whole nation. Imagine if that were you today. Someone came up to you and said, "You're going to become the next president of the United States." What would that have looked like? But beyond that, this little boy grew up to be a king who was talked about throughout the rest of this book. And his name was mentioned throughout it as someone who God really honored. But this man had a son. And the son had a really, really cool story. That God told him, "I will give you anything you want." And he asked for wisdom out of all things. And he ended up having a wisdom that was beyond what we could imagine. Imagine you're sitting in school and suddenly your tests just become easy. Everything that you do becomes easy because you have the knowledge and the wisdom to do so. And so this man, from him, a bunch of other kings come after him. One certain king in particular, and the same story in the same book, if you're getting what I'm saying. In the same story in the same book, there's a king who 3 really key things happen to him. His nation is being surrounded by an army. And he goes to God and gets on his hands and knees and prays, and he says, "God, these people are mocking you. Please send them away." And within the night, God sends an angel to kill 185,000 men. And the rest of the army flees that night. But it didn't stop there in this man's life. Instead, it went on even further. And in the same story, in the same book, this man was on his deathbed dying. And he prayed out to God, asking him just for another chance. And this God gave him 15 more years to his life. Can you imagine? You're dying on the brink of death, and suddenly you're healed, and you get 15 more years to your life. That would be incredible. Not only this, though, but he asked God for a sign in the middle of all this. And everyone looked up at the sky and saw the sun go back 10 hours. How incredible would that be? In the same story, in the same book, I read about a group of people who could predict the future. But not like most people that we think of psychics and these other people who predict the future. But they claim that they hear God's words and are repeating them. And this God is saying that one day you will be conquered by a couple of nations. That you will be going into slavery and you will be there for a while. You can imagine the people's reaction to these stories. They hated it. They didn't want to believe it. And yet these people were claiming, this is what God says, it will happen, and it did. But there's a story above them all that I want to talk to you guys about this morning that means so much more. And the story is unlike any other, I think, in this book. And so, in the same story, in the same book, an unconventional thing happens.
Imagine a woman who's in her teens, her early teens. And back in this day, it was normal for teens to get married. And so imagine this girl plowing the fields, going and wringing out clothes, and doing typical work in a small village. This is almost kind of like us. You know, we're average people. There's nothing inherently special to what we're doing. But yet this girl is going about her normal life. And in a moment, her life has changed. But I'll get to that in a moment. Instead, her soon-to-be husband is doing the exact same thing. A year before he got married to this woman, he decided to start building a house for her, to get everything ready for when their family came. And as he's going about, he is so excited. Can you imagine getting married and just preparing your family? What a great opportunity. But something happened that changed everything. One day, as he's walking around his village, he hears that his future wife is now pregnant. And this is a scandalous story. It's a scandal of a lifetime. Suddenly, he went from being the happiest man alive to now the saddest and most depressed man alive. He got to the point where he didn't know what to do. Back in his day, the punishment for doing that was either death or by divorce. And he was like, how in the world do I go about divorcing this woman without making a big scene? And so you can almost just imagine the stress that he's going through. He's still trying to work hard, but there's so much stress on him. And imagine this. One day, he's working throughout the day, he's tired, he's exhausted, and he sits down and he's trying to figure out how to divorce this woman, how to do this in a good way. But he can't. And so after his exhaustion, he goes and lies down. And suddenly, he wakes up in a dream and sees an angel appear to him. What would happen if this had happened to you? What would you have done? If it were me, I would be trembling. I wouldn't know what to do. Imagine this heavenly figure that is just glowing and is standing over top of you. And this is exactly what this man did. He fell on his face, and he was trembling. And this angel said, hold on, do not be afraid. I've come to give you good news. And this good news is about your future wife. You can imagine this moment. He's asking all these questions, wondering, what about her? The fact that she cheated on me? The fact that now she's pregnant and I have to divorce her? This angel stopped him, though, and said, no, your wife isn't pregnant because of any man, but because God has allowed her to. Let that sink in. Think about that. If an angel appeared to you in a scandalous and terrible situation and said, this is happening to you for a reason. And so the angel goes on to say, the son will be called, you probably guessed it, Jesus. And he'll be known as Emmanuel. And I love that word because Emmanuel means God with us. And when Jesus was on the earth, God was with them. And so the story continues that he wakes up and immediately he gets married to his wife. This is also unheard of because, as I said before, you have a whole year to prepare, and yet he's getting married right off the bat. But to back up this story and to kind of help it develop more, this woman named Mary, she had a relative in a nearby town called, well, I don't know what the town was called, but her name was Elizabeth. And her husband had one of the coolest jobs ever. He got to go into God's temple and offer incense. Basically, it was just a way to please God. And so he walks in there and he's doing his job, and suddenly before him, just like Joseph, an angel appears to him. And he, in the same way, is trembling and doesn't know what to do. And this angel says, I have heard your prayer, and you will have a son. Now, the only problem was this man was incredibly old, and he couldn't have children. Him and his wife couldn't have children. And so he's saying, but how in the world is this possible? My wife is old, she can't have children. And he said, no, you will have a child, and you will name him John, for he will pave the way for what God has in the future. But he continues to question him. And as the angel says, since you are questioning me, you will now be silent and mute for the next 9 months. And he can't speak at all. Suddenly, it's almost like his lips are shut and he can't say a word. And so he walks out of where he's working, and all these people gather around and are asking him, what happened to you? What happened to you? And he can't say a word. He can't even say his son's name. So 9 months pass, and his wife Elizabeth finally delivers this child, and they're debating about what to name him. And this man grabs a tablet and writes on it, his name is to be John. And at that moment, when he showed it to them, he could now speak. So, as you can see, the impossible is happening over and over and over. And the stories that I told before this, one incident happened, and then a period of time would pass. And then another thing would happen, and then a period of time would pass. But this is one after another. Just miracle, miracle, miracle happening. On top of this, though, if this weren't enough for you, and if this doesn't make you think really hard about this, imagine this. Those shepherds, just like that boy that I was talking about, were out in the middle of a field one day. And these shepherds, again, are the lowest of the low. They have almost no value where they're at. They're almost considered filthy and disgusting because they work with animals. And that job is for the low and the poor. And suddenly, one night, as they're going about their job, angels appear in the sky. Angels appear a lot, aren't they? And these angels appear and say, there's good news. A Savior is born in the town of Bethlehem. Go and find him. And they do exactly that. These poor people are shown angels and told them exactly what to go do. And if this weren't enough, on top of this, 2 years after Jesus was born, a group of advisors to a king, you may know them as Magi, they saw a star up in the sky, and they were reminded about something that they were told a long time ago by one of these people who could predict the future. And they said, when you see that star, you will know that a Savior is born, and go see him. And so these advisors to this king pack up these presents, as Lily was talking about, and they bring them to Jesus. Gold, frankincense, and myrrh, the gifts of a king. And so this little boy who went through a scandalous situation is now being given kingly gifts. This is insane. And not only does it stop there, but it continues on. This boy who, at the age of 12, is so smart that he's teaching teachers. Imagine you walked into your classrooms and you began telling the teacher what was going on. I think kids would laugh at you and probably think you're crazy. But you knew exactly what was happening. And as he got older and older, he began claiming that he was the Son of God. And everyone around him said, that's not possible. God doesn't have a son. You can't be him. And yet, here he is claiming these things. So these people are like, we're going to kill you because you can't be saying that. So time passes, and this man gets older and older and older. And when he's about the age of 30, something crazy starts happening. He begins to perform what we call miracles. Exactly what had been happening throughout the rest of the story. And so he's going about to village, this man who has been mocked and ridiculed, and he's going around healing the sick, making the blind see, making the lame walk, and even better, making the dead come back to life. I almost think that that's impossible. I could not believe it. How in the world can a man, not even with medical technology, make this guy raise from the dead, or this woman raise from the dead? But it happened. So you may be asking at this point, why in the world are you telling us this story and this book? Well, because this is exactly what the Bible talks about. And over and over and over and over and over again, God's showing them signs of, here I am, follow me. You almost would say after the first creation and the first miracle that you'd start believing, right? But I want to continue the story of Jesus a little bit further and go a little bit deeper into what he had to say. So, after he was doing these miracles, he decided to get a group of 12 men together. And these men were going to be the people that he would disciple, that he'd pour everything into. And they're going around watching what he's doing. And in this time, they themselves begin to start performing these miracles, raising the dead, casting out demons, making the blind see. And Jesus went on to say, you will do even more than what I'm doing. These men saw Jesus, as I talked about in the story, in my story, They saw him calming the waters. They saw him walking on water. You think that they would have faith unlike any other, right? But that's wrong. In Matthew 28:17, it's right before Jesus leaves them and goes up into heaven. And the story goes that these disciples who had been watching Jesus and been watching him do all these things were listening to him, but there's a couple words in there that I love. And it says, but some doubted. I'd be asking the question, how in the world do these people doubt God when they're watching him do miracles and they're still questioning who he is? How is that even possible? So for you today, I want you to think about in your lives, what is a miracle in your all's lives? Because I would say the fact that you all, one, were born was a miracle. There's so many children who don't even get to be born, or something happens and they aren't born. But you were. You have a purpose. And beyond that, I would even say that the fact that you all are sitting in these chairs right now is a miracle. If this guy, Jesus, that I was talking about, wasn't here, I wouldn't be here. You all wouldn't be here. We'd all be in a lot darker spot. And yet, you all are here. It's really cool to think about. This story, though, continues on a little bit more. After Jesus died and went to heaven, his disciples were coming around praying, asking God what they should do next. And I would think one of the biggest miracles ever happened. Suddenly, within a day, these disciples had God's presence come upon them. They began to speak in other languages, talking to the people in a city called Jerusalem. And people began to hear this message about Jesus and who he was, and they were curious about him. But these were the same people also that were yelling, "Kill him, kill him. He's calling himself the Son of God." And suddenly now they're listening. And a miracle happened. 3,000 people that day were baptized and came to know Jesus. An incredible event. And beyond this, they went and began sharing their possessions and began building a church. And within a day, all this happened. Now, you can only imagine that in your lives, the same exact things can happen. But there's one more thing that I want to mention that kind of plays into all this. One of those guys who could predict the future, his name was Elijah. And Elijah was known for performing countless miracles. That story where fire came down and burnt up a sacrifice, that happened with him. The same thing happened as a miracle when a chariot was going to a city, and he ran past that chariot to the city. A man running faster than a chariot. Countless events happened over and over and over. And there's one story in particular that I love. A same story in the same book where this man is in the middle of a wilderness. And he's crying out to God, "God, I'm about to be killed. Kill me now. I have no purpose in this life. Why don't I just die right now?" Isn't that us some days? Some days don't we feel worthless? Don't we feel like we not have a purpose? That we feel like we should just die right now? And this was the same guy who had saw all these different types of miracles happen. So even a man who saw these miracles didn't believe. Kind of put that in perspective in your own life now. If a miracle happened to you, would you truly believe or would you still doubt? But what I love even further is this man went on to a mountaintop. And on this mountaintop, God said, "I will appear to you." And so a thunderstorm happened, and there's lightning, and there's thunder, and yet God's not speaking. And there's fire that's burning around him and consuming everything, and God's still not there. And in the same story, in the same book, as he's standing on the mountain, an earthquake happens, and the earth is shaking below him, and yet God's still not in that. But then a subtle wind comes by, and he hears the voice of God speak to him. And I love this. I learned this at my church, and I think I've enjoyed listening to it and applying it in my life. God is close. He doesn't need to yell in our lives to get our attention. He doesn't need miracles to happen for us to believe. You see, through Elijah, God showed us that he's close. He's speaking into our ear and telling us exactly what we need to hear if we're open to listening to him. And so here's this man now filled with God and going out and doing even more miracles. And I think the same thing can apply in our lives. That some days we may be doubting God's power. We may be doubting, God, you can't do miracles. But I would also say that we're doubting what God can do. And yet I just showed all these stories to where God was like, I'm here, I'm here, I'm here. And yet in every single one of these stories, people still doubted God. So when we're thinking about celebrating a God who can do the unbelievable, is it really true that he can do the unbelievable? Do we want to believe that in our lives? I do. I wish I could go and be healing people right now. I wish I could be going and walking on water. I'd be doing it all the time. But what would it look like? And be honest, I want to take this one step further. What would it look like if we began to have God in our lives? You see, these people who were predicting the future, they said that we imagine and we picture people in the future who have God within them. Now we think about, okay, that's cool and all, but you saw these miracles. God was obviously showing up in your life. But they said, no, you get something, you get a gift that's even more precious than that. You see, this God who they had to go through hoops and leaps to try and get to this God suddenly was like, I'm going to be in you now. I'm going to be in your presence daily, whispering to you daily, and I want to be in your lives daily. And these men were craving it. They wanted this, but they didn't get it. But the reality is, we get it. That's something that each of us, when we're baptized, we receive. We receive this gift of God inside of us. And so what would it look like if we decide to finally accept that God is in our lives, that he loves us, and that he wants to give us attributes of what he has? In the Bible, it talks about these things called the fruit of the Spirit. And they're things like love and joy. And imagine you go about life having an infinite amount of love in your life. Not because what you do, but because there's a guy inside of you who's doing it. Suddenly, those people who become really annoying and just bug you in school, you have an infinite amount of patience with. Suddenly, all these situations in which you don't feel like you can give anything else, you have the ability to give. What about in these situations where you're being tempted and you want to sin? You have an infinite amount of self-control backing you up and saying, you can do this, fight this battle. What would it look like? What would it look like if we began to walk with an infinite amount of love, with an infinite amount of joy, an infinite amount of peace, of patience, of kindness, of goodness, of faithfulness, of gentleness, and of self-control? What would it look like if you guys accepted that God is in your life and began to start doing things that you never thought were possible? Maybe then the impossible would be possible. I want to leave you all with this. God has given us this gift. And he's saying, if you just believe, it can happen. Now, that's not to say go and start claiming that everything's true and that you can go and do blah, blah, blah. But know that everything is possible through God. And on top of this, there's a great story that Jesus said and talked about. And it was a man who, his kid was dying. And he came to Jesus sobbing and saying, my kid is dying, I don't know what to do. And Jesus said, just believe and he'll be healed. Just believe. When God says that the faith of a mustard seed can move mountains, I believe it. That man at that point wanted nothing more than his son to be healed. And Jesus said, just believe and he'll be healed. And that's exactly what happened. And so they're going to put here on the screen Ephesians 3:14 through 21. And I love this because this should be what we're focusing on daily. For this reason, I kneel before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and on earth derives its name. I pray that out of his glorious riches, he may strengthen you with power through his Spirit and in your inner being. And I love this word power because power simply means the ability to do something. So when we hear God give us this power, give us these abilities to perform miracles, they're simply just a way of doing and carrying out God's kingdom. Because I want to say in verse 17, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith, that little bit of faith. And I pray that you, being rooted and established in love, may have power, together with all the Lord's holy people, to grasp how wide and how long and how high and how deep is the love of Christ. Again, an infinite amount of love. And it goes on to say, and to know that this love that surpasses knowledge, you can't fathom this, that you may be filled to the measure of all the fullness of God. Now to him who is able to do immeasurably more than all we could ask or imagine, according to his power that is at work within us. To him be the glory in the church and in Christ Jesus throughout all generations, forever and ever. Amen. And he's saying this because you will be filled with something that you don't know, but can do the impossible. To someone who can do immeasurably more than we can ask or imagine. I want to leave you with a single question just to think about. In your lives, what would happen if you all started to live this way? Begin to live and follow this journey with God. If you haven't started that, come talk to me, because this journey is one that you don't want to miss out on. But I want to leave you with this question of what would happen. Would you all bow your heads with me? Dear God, we just come before you so thankful. We thank you so much that, Lord, you give us power beyond what we can imagine, Lord, but not for ourselves, but to do and to win others to you. God, would you let us accept you? Would you just let us accept your love and your joy and your patience and all the things that you've promised us that we will have when we're following you? God, please just be in our lives. I pray that this Christmas, it's an unexplainable and unpredictable Christmas, God, that you will do the unbelievable. And instead of focusing on what we're going to be getting for Christmas, instead be focusing on what we already have, this gift, this present of Jesus and what he has to offer. God, would we please walk around just expressing you and wanting nothing more than you, knowing that we can celebrate this Christmas a God who can do the unbelievable. We love you so much, Father, and we just ask this in your Son's name. Amen.